Hi, I'm Samir. Welcome to Legends from the Past. On this channel, I transform history's greatest stories into epic narratives while maintaining historical accuracy. My mission is simple: to breathe new life into the tales of kings, conquerors, and empires that shaped our world. Here, you won't just learn about history, you'll live it. From the battlefield strategies of legendary commanders to the intimate thoughts of ancient rulers, tonight's tale takes us to ancient Greece, where we'll follow the extraordinary transformation of Achilles. So sit back and join me as we journey into the past, where myth meets reality and legends come alive. This is Legends from the Past. Let's begin.
Blood dripped from Achilles' hands into the Aegean surf, each crimson drop a mockery of divine ichor. The late afternoon sun caught the falling droplets, transforming them into rubies before they disappeared into the wine-dark sea. He watched them fall, counting each one like a soldier's prayer gone unanswered, and smiled. The salt air carried the iron scent of victory across the beach, mingling with the sweet smoke of funeral pyres that dotted the shoreline like accusatory fingers, pointed at the heavens. Behind him, Apollo's temple burned. The marble columns that had stood for generations now lay shattered, their pristine white stained with soot and blood. The priests who had sought sanctuary within its walls had learned a harsh lesson about divine protection. Their bodies now decorated the steps like fallen leaves, their golden robes turned crimson, their final prayers lost in the crash of waves and the crackle of sacred wood burning. "They say you're blessed by the gods," the last priest had gasped that morning, blood bubbling on his lips as he clutched at Achilles' ankle. The warrior had knelt beside him, bronze armor still smoking from where Apollo's arrows had glanced, off without leaving a mark. "Then let them come save you," Achilles had whispered, his voice carrying across the sand like thunder. He had made sure the priest's death was slow, deliberate, a performance for divine eyes. Each cut had been placed with surgical precision, turning the man's dying moments into a message written in blood. Your blessings mean nothing. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Achilles stood ankle-deep in the surf, letting the waves wash the evidence of his work from his skin. Not all of it, though. He left traces of blood on his arms, his armor, his face, war paint that marked him not as the gods' chosen, but as their scourge. The Myrmidons feasted further up the beach, their victory songs carrying across the dunes. But their voices held notes of unease, their celebration tempered by what they had witnessed. They had watched their leader wade through Apollo's chosen warriors like a storm through wheat, each death a deliberate mockery of divine protection. Their own prayers, once confident, now emerged as uncertain whispers. What gods could you trust, when their greatest champion had become their greatest curse? Patroclus stood alone among the dunes, watching his friend's transformation with eyes that saw too much. The Achilles he had grown up with, trained with, laughed with, was becoming something else, something terrible and magnificent. The boy who had once raced him along these same beaches, who had shared wine and songs and dreams of glory, now moved like a force of nature, each step leaving bloody footprints in the sand. "You didn't have to kill the younger ones," Patroclus said finally, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Achilles' ears. "They were barely more than children." Achilles turned, water swirling around his feet, and his smile held all the warmth of a midwinter night. "They chose to serve false masters," he said. "They chose to believe in protection that was never real. I taught them truth with their last breaths." A cool wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it the scents of salt and copper and burning oil. In the distance, Troy's walls stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, their height meant to challenge the heavens themselves. Achilles gazed at them, his eyes reflecting the flames of the burning temple. "The gods play with us, brother," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for Patroclus. "They pull our strings and call it fate. They grant us gifts and call it favor. But their gifts are chains, their favor a cage." He lifted his hands, still stained with priest's blood, and spread them wide. "I was born of divine blood, trained by immortals, blessed beyond measure. And what has it brought me? A life mapped out before my first breath, a death foretold before my first step. Patroclus moved closer, his feet silent on the sand. "You could still choose differently," he said. "The prophecy offers a choice between chains." Achilles laughed, and the sound sent nearby gulls wheeling into the sky. "Live long in obscurity or die young in glory. That's not choice, brother. That's just another game for their amusement." He turned back to the sea, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "But I'll show them true choice. I'll take their prophecy and turn it into a weapon. Let them watch as their favorite son becomes their greatest shame." In the gathering darkness, the funeral pyres burned brighter, their smoke carrying the souls of Apollo's servants up toward an indifferent heaven. The Myrmidon's songs had shifted to darker melodies, ancient hymns transformed into dirges. They sang not of divine glory now, but of mortal defiance, of blood on bronze and faith undone. A messenger appeared at the edge of the firelight, his young face pale with urgency. "My lord," he called, his voice trembling slightly. "Word from the Greek camp. Agamemnon demands your presence. He says," the boy swallowed hard. "He says the gods have spoken to him of your actions here." Achilles' laugh this time was softer, more dangerous. "Of course they have," he said. "Tell Agamemnon I'll come when the temple's ashes are cold. Let him pray to his gods for patience." He paused, then added with a cold smile, "Tell him to pray loudly. It amuses me to hear heaven's silence." The messenger retreated, leaving Achilles and Patroclus alone with the sound of the surf. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, washing the beach clean of blood, only to have it stained again with each drip from Achilles' hands. He made no move to clean himself further, wearing the gore like others wore royal purple. "There will be consequences," Patroclus said finally, watching the last light fade from the sky. "The gods may be distant, but they are not blind." "Good," Achilles replied, his voice carrying the finality of a blade being drawn. "Let them see. Let them remember this day, when their chosen son first showed them true defiance. This is just the beginning, brother." He turned to face the burning temple one last time, his silhouette carved against the flames. "I'll make them question every prophecy, doubt every omen. I'll show every mortal who watches that they're divine. Masters can bleed, if not their golden blood, then the red blood of their servants." In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, though no clouds were visible among the stars. Achilles smiled up at the sound, raising one bloody hand in mock salute. "Yes," he whispered, "I hear you. But do you hear me?" The thunder faded, leaving only the crash of waves and the crackle of flames. On the beach, the Myrmidons watched, their leader with a mixture of awe and fear, sensing that they stood at the edge of something momentous. Their songs died away entirely, leaving a silence heavy with possibility and dread. Patroclus remained, a steady presence in the growing dark, watching his friend become something new, something that might shake the foundations of heaven itself. The night wind carried the scent of change, blood and bronze, smoke and salt, and underneath it all the copper taste of destiny being rewritten by mortal hands. The stars emerged fully now, their divine light reflecting off the bloody surf. Achilles stood between sea and shore, between mortal and divine, his choice made and his path set. The gods had given him unmatched strength, divine blood, and a prophecy of glory. He would use every gift to mock their very existence, turn every blessing into a curse aimed back at heaven's gates. The god-spurner's dawn had broken, and with it the old certainties began to crumble. The age of unquestioning faith in divine will was ending, washed away by waves stained with the blood of heaven's servants. A new age was beginning, written not in divine ichor, but in the red blood of mortals who dared to question their celestial masters. And on the beach, Achilles smiled, already planning his next act of defiance. Dawn broke over the Greek camp like a blade drawn from its sheath, sharp and promising violence. Smoke still rose from Apollo's temple on the distant shore, a dark finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. In Agamemnon's tent, golden light filtered through dyed cloth, casting the assembled kings in shades of blood and honey. They waited, these lords of war, fingering sword hilts and watching the entrance with the wary eyes of men who had seen something fundamental shift in their world. Agamemnon sat upon his wooden throne, draped in purple-edged robes and golden rings that marked him as supreme commander. Around him, bronze tripods burned with incense, and sacred artifacts from a dozen city-states created a theater of power. But there was fear beneath the pageantry. It showed in the sweat on his brow, in the white-knuckled grip on his scepter of office. When Achilles entered, he brought the smell of iron and salt with him. Dried blood still caked his arms and armor, and his footprints left red marks on the woven rugs. The assembled kings drew back, not from supernatural awe, but from the cold calculation in his eyes. Here was a man who had systematically slaughtered Apollo's priests, who had turned sacred ritual into brutal execution, and who now stood before them unmarked by either wound or remorse. "You summoned me," Achilles said, his voice carrying the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. His gaze swept the tent, noting each divine symbol, each gesture of religious authority. His lips curved in what might have been a smile. "I assume the gods have been whispering in your ear again. Agamemnon?" The king's face flushed dark above his beard. "You mock what you do not understand, son of Peleus. The gods. Achilles moved to one of the sacred tripods, dipped his bloodied hands in the blessed water meant for purification. The liquid turned pink as he cleaned them with deliberate slowness. "Tell me, when they speak to you, do they mention how their priests died? Do they describe the sounds they made, the prayers they offered?" He dried his hands on a sacred cloth, leaving red streaks across white linen. "Or do they perhaps speak only of power and pride and punishment?" From the shadows at the edge of the tent, Briseis watched. She saw what others missed, the politics. Beneath the pageantry, the human greed masked as divine will. Her own status as prize of war had taught her to read these currents of power. Now she saw Agamemnon's fear disguised as righteous anger, saw Achilles' rebellion wrapped in quiet mockery. "The gods," Agamemnon rose, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd outside, "have shown me their will. For your blasphemy, for your defiance, they demand satisfaction." He paused, building the moment. "They demand I take Briseis as punishment for your crimes." The tent fell silent. Even the morning breeze seemed to hold its breath. The assembled kings watched Achilles, hands tight on weapons, expecting violence. Instead, they got something far more terrifying: laughter. It started low, almost thoughtful, then built to fill the tent with its cold mirth. Achilles laughed like a man who had seen through every pretense, every lie, down to the bare bones of truth. "Of course they do," he said finally, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. "The gods demand you take a beautiful woman as your prize. How convenient their justice aligns with your desires. I dare much more than that." Achilles' voice cut through the bluster like a bronze blade through silk. Take her and wrap your greed in divine mandate. But remember, this moment, when you used the gods as a cloak for your own wants. Remember it when the Trojans come, when your men die, when you pray for help that will not come." The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of unease spreading through the assembled warriors. Outside, the news was already spreading through the camp in whispers and murmurs. The Myrmidons gathered in small groups, their discipline showing in their stillness, their danger in their silence. Near the training grounds, Patroclus watched the Myrmidons prepare for withdrawal. Gone were the usual prayers and rituals before practice. Instead, there was only the sharp ring of bronze on bronze, the grunt of effort, the focus on human skill and strength. He saw how the other Greeks watched, saw doubt begin to creep into their expressions as they witnessed warfare stripped of divine ceremony. "He goes too far," one of the older warriors muttered, watching a Myrmidon unit train with mechanical precision. The gods will what?" The question came from a young soldier, his face scarred from recent fighting. Did they protect Apollo's priests? Did they strike him down for burning their temple? He touched his sword hilt, thoughtful. Perhaps Achilles shows us truth, that skill and strength matter more than prayer. The idea spread like fire through dry grass. Warriors gathered in quiet groups, discussing possibilities that would have been unthinkable days before. What if the gods were not as powerful as claimed? What if human strength, human skill, human will were enough? As the sun climbed higher, Agamemnon's heralds came for Briseis. They brought ceremonial robes, sacred oils, all the trappings of divine authority. Achilles watched them approach his tent, his expression one of almost academic interest. When they reached for Briseis, he made no move to stop them. His restraint proved more unnerving than any display of rage. "You see?" one herald whispered to another. "The gods have humbled him." Achilles heard, and his smile was a thing of winter. "Tell me," he called to them, "when you sleep tonight, will you thank the gods for protecting you? Will you believe that divine mandate keeps you safe?" He turned to Briseis, his voice softening slightly. "The choice is yours. Go or stay, but choose for yourself, not for gods or kings." Briseis met his gaze, read the currents of power and politics in play. Then she stepped forward, head high, refusing to play the part of weeping prize. Her every movement rejected the ceremony they tried to impose, turned religious ritual into empty theater. The Myrmidon camp dismantled itself with military precision. No wailing, no chaos, no disorder. Just the methodical efficiency of a force bred for war. They packed their weapons, their supplies, their armor, leaving behind the sacred tokens and battle shrines that had once marked their grounds. In their silence lay a message louder than any protest. They did not need divine blessing to be deadly. As night fell, the first Trojan probing attacks came. Across the battlefield, Greek warriors found themselves reaching for absent lucky charms, missing the comfort of familiar prayers. Their formation held, but doubt had taken root. Every casualty, every setback sparked whispers. Would this have happened if Achilles fought with them? Did the gods truly protect, or had they always survived on skill alone? In his tent, Achilles sat sharpening his spear. Each stroke of the whetstone was deliberate, rhythmic, a meditation on the nature of power and belief. Patroclus watched. Him work, noting how other sounds fell away. Even the distant clash of combat seemed to dim beneath that steady scraping. "They say the Trojans grow bolder," Patroclus said finally, "that Apollo guides their arrows." Apollo guided his priests' prayers too. Achilles tested his spear's edge with his thumb, drew a bead of red. Look how well that served them. He held the weapon up, letting lamplight play along its bronze length. This is real. The skill to use it is real. The strength to drive it home is real. All else is smoke and story, meant to keep us bent in prayer while kings play at being gods. P.S. Outside, beyond the camp's edges, the night grew thick with sound. The clash of bronze, the cries of wounded men, the crackle of watchfires. Somewhere in that darkness, Trojans gathered, growing bolder with each hour that Achilles' spear remained, absent from the field. Their own priests would be burning offerings, chanting prayers, promising divine favor. Achilles smiled at the thought, continued his methodical sharpening. Let them pray. Let them burn offerings and trust in divine protection. He had shown how empty those promises were, had painted that truth in the blood of Apollo's own priests. Now he would let consequence demonstrate what he had begun. Each Trojan victory, each Greek defeat would drive home the lesson, trust in human strength, for the gods cared nothing for mortal struggles. Dawn would come again, bringing with it fire and blood and death, but it would also bring something new. Questions where once certainty had ruled, doubt where faith had stood unshaken. Achilles had not needed to shake the earth or command the elements. He had done something far more devastating. He had made men think. In the distance, the smoke from Apollo's temple had finally dissipated, leaving the night sky clear and star-filled. Those same stars had watched generations of men pray, fight, and die. They would watch this change too, this slow unraveling of certainty, this rebellion not of lightning and thunder but of quiet thought and growing doubt. Achilles set aside his spear, the edge now sharp enough to split a hair. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own choices, its own opportunities to show that mortal will could stand against divine decree. For now, he had planted the seeds of change, not with supernatural displays or divine defiance, but with something far more dangerous, the simple human act of questioning what had always been believed. The night deepened, and with it came the sound of more ships landing on the shore. Reinforcements from distant Greek cities, come to join a war that had already begun to change from a divine mandate into something else, a contest of human will, human strength and human choice. The gods might watch from their mountaintop, but on the blood-soaked fields below, men were beginning to look to themselves for strength. And in his tent, Achilles smiled, knowing that some victories were won, not with spears and shields, but with doubt and questions and the slow, inexorable power of human thought. Bronze rang against bronze as the Greek shield wall shattered. Patroclus drove his spear through a Trojan's throat, the practiced motion almost casual, then ripped it free in a spray of arterial red. Around him, the younger soldiers were breaking, formation, falling back toward the ships in growing panic. Veterans tried to hold the line, but even they felt the absence of that one vital warrior, that one man whose presence had always meant victory. Another Trojan rushed forward, shield high, sword seeking Patroclus's ribs. The Greek champion pivoted, letting the blade slide past, then brought his shield's bronze-shod edge up into the man's jaw. Bone cracked, blood sprayed. The Trojan fell, and Patroclus was already moving to the next threat, the next gap in the failing line. "Hold!" His voice carried over the chaos of combat, steadying the men nearest him. "Shield to shield, don't let them split us!" He demonstrated his command, stepping into position beside a trembling young soldier, their shields overlapping. Others followed, the line reforming like a wound scabbing over. The Trojans pressed their advantage, sensing weakness. Their front ranks crashed against the reformed shield wall like waves against a cliff, spears thrust into gaps, swords probed for weakness. Men died on both sides, their last breaths lost in the cacophony of battle. Smoke rolled across the battlefield as the first ships caught fire. The Greeks had beached their vessels in neat rows, an act of confidence that now proved foolish. Flames spread quickly across tarred wood and canvas sails, sending black clouds to obscure the afternoon sun. In that artificial dusk, bronze armor gleamed like stars, and blood looked black as pitch. Patroclus fought with the precision of long training, each movement economical and deadly. He had learned alongside Achilles, had absorbed the same lessons in warfare, though he'd never matched his friend's divine speed and strength. Now he put those lessons to use, leading by example, showing what mortal skill could accomplish. But it wasn't enough. The line broke again further down the beach. Trojans poured through the gap, threatening to flank the entire Greek position. Patroclus saw the danger and made the hard choice. "Fall back to the ships, controlled withdrawal. Keep your shields up." He suited action to words, stepping backward in measured pace. His men followed, maintaining formation even in retreat. They drilled this movement countless times, though always advancing rather than retreating. The fighting shifted to the narrow spaces between beached ships. Here the Trojans' numbers meant less. Greek carpenters' mates joined the battle, wielding axes meant for shipwork as weapons. Every yard of sand was contested, bought with blood, and courage and desperation. As sunset painted the sky crimson, Patroclus finally called the full retreat. His men fell back to the Myrmidon camp, where Achilles sat before his tent, watching the battle's end, with eyes that revealed nothing. The smoke of burning ships cast strange shadows across his face, turning him into something ancient and terrible. Later, as night deepened and the sounds of combat faded to the groans of wounded men, Patroclus poured wine for both of them. The vintage was Thracian, thick and sweet, a sharp contrast to the bitter smoke that still filled the air. Across the brazier, Achilles sat cleaning his unused spear, each stroke of the cloth deliberate and precise. "They pray to Apollo for protection," Patroclus said, watching his friend's methodical work. "The young ones especially. It gives them courage." "False courage," Achilles replied without looking up. "Built on lies and empty air. Better they learn to trust their shields and spears." "And what of the men who died today trusting shields and spears? What comfort do we offer their shades?" Now Achilles did look up, his eyes reflecting the brazier's flames. "Truth, the only gift worth giving. Better they die knowing their own strength than believing in divine protection that never comes." Patroclus sipped his wine, letting memory wash over him. They had been boys together, training under Chiron, learning the arts of war and peace. Even then, Achilles had questioned everything, had pushed against accepted wisdom. But there had been joy in his rebellion then, not this cold certainty. "Do you remember," he said carefully, "the boar hunt in the hills above Pythia, when the beast charged and you threw your spear and missed?" Achilles finished, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "While you stood your ground and took it in the throat. Yes, I remember. What of it? You said then that Apollo guided your spear astray, teaching humility, that the gods sometimes instruct through failure." The smile vanished. "I was young. Foolish. The spear missed because I aimed poorly, nothing more. Any wisdom gained came from my own reflection, not divine instruction." Patroclus leaned forward, the wine forgotten. "And is there no wisdom to be gained now, while our friends die and our ships burn? They die because of mortal pride and mortal choices. Agamemnon's greed, my anger, your loyalty. No gods required to explain any of it." Achilles set his spear. Aside, the bronze head gleaming dully in the firelight. "The gods are a story we tell ourselves to avoid facing hard truths, that we live, fight, and die by our own choices." The night deepened around them, filled with the sounds of an army at rest. Somewhere nearby a soldier sang a hymn to Apollo, his voice cracking on the high notes. Others joined in, the ancient melody carrying across the camp like a prayer. "Listen to them," Patroclus said softly. "Faith gives them strength to face tomorrow's battles. Who are we to take that from them? Faith is a crutch that fails when needed most. I would give them something stronger, belief in themselves." Achilles rose, his movement liquid grace even in repose. "Sleep, brother. Tomorrow will bring more battles, more choices, more consequences, all of them mortal, all of them ours." But sleep proved elusive. Patroclus lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the camp. He could pick out individual noises, the stamp of horses, the clatter of weapons being cleaned, the murmur of men standing watch, all of it so human, so fragile, so precious. Dawn came too soon, painting the sky in shades of flame. The Trojans would attack again, pressing their advantage while they had it. Already their war cries carried across the plain, mixed with the clash of weapons being readied. Patroclus found Achilles at the edge of their camp, looking toward Troy's distant walls. The morning light caught his armor, making the bronze shine like captured fire. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the enemy form up for attack. "If you won't fight," Patroclus said finally, "let me take your place." Achilles turned, really looking at his friend for the first time in days. "You would wear my armor? Lead the Myrmidons?" "Someone must. The men need a symbol, even if you've lost faith in symbols. They need skill and courage, not theatrical displays." "Sometimes," Patroclus countered, "the display itself gives courage. You taught me that once." Another silence stretched between them, heavy with memory and meaning. Finally Achilles nodded. "Take it then. Show them what mortal skill can do, but remember, the armor may look divine, but it will not make you immortal." The arming sequence was a ritual they had performed countless times, but never like this. Each piece of armor carried its own weight of memory and meaning, the greaves that had flashed like lightning across battlefields, the breastplate that had turned countless spears, the helmet whose horsehair crest had become a banner of victory. As Patroclus donned each piece, he felt the transformation beginning. Not into something divine or immortal, but into a symbol of hope for men who desperately needed it. The Myrmidons gathered to watch, their faces showing a complex mix of emotions. They knew this wasn't their true leader, but perhaps that made it more significant, a mortal choosing to stand against fate itself. The final piece was the spear, its bronze head catching the morning sun. Patroclus held it for a moment, feeling its perfect balance, its deadly promise. Then he turned to the assembled warriors, his voice carrying across the sacred silence of pre-battle. "Today we fight not for gods or glory, but for each other. Shield to shield, spear to spear, mortal strength against mortal strength. Let them say what we can do." The Myrmidons roared their approval, ranks forming with practiced precision. Achilles watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. As Patroclus moved to take his position at the front, his friend caught his arm. "Remember who and what you are," Achilles said softly. No divine blood flows in your veins. No prophecy shapes your path. That is your strength, not your weakness. Patroclus nodded once, then lowered his visor. The transformation was complete. To all watching eyes, Achilles had returned to battle. But beneath the borrowed armor beat a mortal heart. Guided by mortal wisdom and mortal courage, the Trojans had nearly reached the Greek lines. Their own champions strode before the army, Hector's bronze armor gleaming, his spear held high. The sight would have struck terror into lesser men, but the Myrmidons stood firm, shields overlapped, spears ready. Patroclus took one last deep breath, feeling the weight of armor and responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Then he gave the signal, and the Myrmidons began their advance. Each step was measured, deliberate, the product of endless drills and shared purpose. They moved not as individuals, but as a single organism of bronze and determination. The distance closed. The morning air filled with war cries and prayers, the clash of bronze on bronze, the eternal song of men meeting in battle. Patroclus raised the famous spear, its point aimed at heaven like an accusation. Let the gods watch, he thought. Let them see what mortals could achieve. Then he gave the final command, and the Myrmidons charged into legend. The young runner's sandals left bloody prints in the sand. As he staggered into the Myrmidon camp, his bronze armor was dented, his shield lost somewhere on the battlefield, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much. Achilles watched his approach with the stillness of a hunter noting prey, though something in the boy's demeanor made his fingers tighten on his spear shaft. "Speak," he commanded, his voice carrying across the evening air like bronze striking bronze. "Ha-siki, Patroclus." The name came out as a broken whisper. The runner fell to his knees, chest heaving. "Hector, at the Scaean gate." He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. The truth was written in his trembling hands, in his tear-streaked face, in the way he couldn't meet Achilles' gaze. For a long moment, silence ruled the camp. Even the evening breeze seemed to hold its breath. Achilles remained motionless, his expression unchanged, but those who knew him best saw the subtle shifts, the whitening of knuckles on the spear shaft, the slight narrowing of eyes, the way his jaw clenched beneath skin suddenly drawn tight as a drum. When he finally moved, it was with the deliberate grace of a lion uncoiling. He lifted his spear, studying how the setting sun painted its bronze head crimson. "Tell me," he said, his voice terrifyingly soft, "did he die well?" The runner swallowed, hard. "Like one of the old heroes, my lord. He led us to the very gates of Troy. The Trojans broke before him like waves against a cliff. But Hector—" His voice faltered again. "Hector." Achilles tested the name like a blade's edge. "Did he—" "No? When he struck the killing blow, did he know it wasn't me beneath the armor? Yes, he stripped the helmet first, called it justice, that a mortal who dared wear divine armor should fall to mortal hands." A sound emerged from Achilles' throat, then something between a laugh and a snarl. "Justice, he speaks of justice." The spear in his hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the storm building within. "Go. Tell Agamemnon his prize awaits. Tell him I return to battle." The runner scrambled away, leaving Achilles alone with the weight of consequence. The sun sank lower, painting the western sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in the distance, Troy's walls stood proud and eternal, their stones weathered by centuries of mortal ambition and divine indifference. Memory struck like a physical blow. Patroclus at dawn, donning the famous armor piece by piece. Their last words, heavy with unspoken thoughts. The prophecy that had haunted them both, glory or life, never both, never peace. But it had been Patroclus who fell. Patroclus who paid the price of pride and defiance. The Myrmidons gathered silently, drawn by some instinct that told them everything had changed. These were men who had followed Achilles from childhood, who had watched him transform from divine favorite to divine scourge. Now they saw something new emerging, something carved from grief and honed by rage. "Bring my armor," he commanded, his voice carrying across the gathering darkness. "Not the ceremonial bronze, the battle-worn iron my father gave me. Tonight we show Troy what mortal vengeance looks like." The arming sequence was performed in silence, each piece settling onto his frame like another layer of purpose. No prayers were offered, no libations poured. This was not a ritual for divine favor, but a preparation for mortal retribution. The iron armor was plain, battle-scarred, lacking the ornate decoration of his famous bronze suit. It spoke not of divine heritage, but of human craft and human will. As the last pieces were secured, a figure emerged from the gathering darkness. Thetis, divine mother, sea nymph of ancient power, came not with gifts of godly armor, but with warning in her eyes. "My son," she began, her voice carrying centuries of tide and tempest, "the fates—" "Speak not to me of fates," Achilles' voice cut through hers like a blade through silk. "Your kind plays with prophecy, like children with knucklebones, delighting in mortal suffering. Well, watch now, watch what your games have wrought." He strode past her toward where the Myrmidons waited in formation. These men who had followed Patroclus into battle now stood ready to follow his grief-forged fury. Their eyes showed not the blind faith of religious devotion, but the hard certainty of men who had seen divinity fail and chosen mortal strength. Instead, the attack began at moonrise. No thunderous charge, no war cries to heaven. The Myrmidons moved like hunting wolves, silent and purposeful across the darkened plain. Trojan sentries died with startled gasps, their throats opened before they could raise alarm. Each kill was precise, economical, devoid of theatrical flourish or religious significance. When the main assault came, it struck like an iron fist. Achilles led from the front, his spear finding gaps in armor with mechanical precision. Each thrust, each slash, each kill was a lesson written in blood. Divinity was not required for excellence. The Trojans fell back in growing panic, their formations crumbling before this new kind of warfare. Not glorious combat between heroes, but methodical slaughter by men who had abandoned divine theater for mortal efficiency. Near the Scaean gate, where Patroclus had fallen, Achilles found his first true resistance. A Trojan champion, young and beautiful as a god, raised his shield and called upon Apollo for protection. Achilles let him finish his prayer before stepping into range. "Watch now," he called loud enough for all to hear. "Watch how your gods answer." The duel was brief and brutal. No exchanges of lineage, no boasts of divine favor. Just the swift certainty of bronze meeting flesh, the spray of arterial blood painting the dawn sky. As the Trojan fell, his last breath bubbling through the ruin of his throat, Achilles turned to the watching warriors. "Your gods are silent. Your prayers go unanswered. This is the truth I offer. We live and die by our own hands." The battle became a hunt after that. Trojans fled toward their walls like sheep before wolves, dropping weapons and shields in their panic. The Myrmidons pursued with terrible purpose, their spears rising and falling in bloody rhythm. No quarter was asked for, none given. This was not war as the epic poets sang it, but slaughter as only humans could conceive it. Dawn found Achilles standing before Troy's gates, his iron armor painted red from greave to gorget. The plain behind him was littered with Trojan dead, their bodies arranged in a pattern only visible from the walls above, a message written in corpses, a challenge to both gods and men. Hector appeared on the battlements, his bronze armor catching the rising sun. He looked down at the carnage below, at the man who had orchestrated it, and understanding dawned in his eyes. This was not the divine champion he had faced before, not the hero of legend and song. This was something new, grief given form, vengeance made flesh. "Come down," Achilles called, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Come down and see what mortal hands can do. No gods to save you now. No divine intervention to turn spears aside. Just you and me and bronze and blood." Above, the walls of Troy stood silent and eternal, indifferent to the drama playing out before them. The sun climbed higher, turning the blood-soaked plain from black to crimson to rust brown, and in that new day's light, two truths became clear. To all who watched, the gods might laugh at mortal grief, but mortal hands could write answers in blood. And sometimes the most divine act was to stand alone, forsaken but unbroken, and show heaven itself what humanity could do. The hunt had begun. The price would be paid. And somewhere, on that blood-soaked plain, the shade of Patroclus watched, as his friend transformed grief into a weapon that would make even the gods tremble. The first Trojan died before dawn, his blood painting the grey sand black. Achilles drove the spear up through the man's groin, twisted, then ripped upward, splitting him from navel to throat. Entrails spilled like ropes of wet silk, steaming in the cool morning air. The dying man's scream emerged as a wet gurgle, blood fountaining from his ruined throat to spatter against Achilles' iron armor. "Watch," Achilles commanded the other sentries, his voice as calm as a philosopher teaching geometry. "This is how men die when their gods abandon them." He yanked the spear free with surgical precision, letting arterial spray paint patterns across the sand. The body collapsed, twitching, organs sliding free like obscene offerings to the pre-dawn dark. The remaining sentries broke formation, some running, others raising spears with shaking hands. Achilles moved through them like a butcher through livestock, each kill deliberately different. A spear through the eye, bronze point erupting from the back of the skull. A sword stroke that opened a man from shoulder to hip, ribs cracking like dry branches as bronze parted flesh and bone. A shield blow that crushed a warrior's face into red ruin, teeth scattering across the sand like fallen pearls. 6 men died in 6 different ways, each death a demonstration of human craft perfected. Achilles arranged their corpses with methodical care, positioning limbs and weapons to create a tableau of mortal fragility. Their blood soaked the sand, turning grey to black to red as dawn finally broke. "An interesting composition," Odysseus observed from horseback, studying the arrangement of bodies. "You've become an artist of death. Every kill is a lesson." Achilles cleaned his spear with practiced efficiency. "Today, Troy learns how thoroughly their gods have failed them." The Myrmidons spread across the plain like wolves scenting prey, their iron armor dark against the morning light. They had learned their leader's methods well. When they found a group of Trojan foragers, there was no heroic challenge, no exchange of lineages, just the whisper of bronze through flesh, the crack of breaking bones, the wet sound of bodies falling. Achilles walked among the dead, correcting his men's work with quiet instructions. "The spine severs more cleanly at the 4th vertebra," he demonstrated, his hands positioning a corpse. "See how the head lolls? That's the angle we want. It reminds them of sacrifice but perverted, a mockery of their rituals." Near the Scaean gate, they found richer prey, a temple guard, 20 men in bronze armor decorated with Apollo's symbols. They had arranged themselves in proper phalanx formation, shields overlapped, spears bristling. Their captain stepped forward, raising his sword in challenge. "In Apollo's name," he began. Achilles took his head with a single sword stroke, bronze parting flesh and bone with surgical precision. Blood fountained high, catching the morning sun like rubies before painting the captain's men in their leader's life. They broke formation, then discipline shattering in the face of methodical slaughter. The killing that followed was a demonstration of warfare stripped to its essence. Achilles moved through their ranks like a sculptor approaching marble, each stroke deliberate, each death unique. One man's arm separated at the elbow, arterial spray-painting spirals across shields. Another's belly opened like ripe fruit, steam rising from exposed organs in the cool air. A third lost his legs at the knees, then his arms at the shoulders, then his head, transformed into component parts with butcher's precision. "Watch," Achilles called to the walls. "Watch how your divine protectors fail. Watch what mortal hands can achieve." His voice carried clearly over the sounds of dying men, over the wet impacts of bronze on flesh, over the crunch of breaking bone. By mid-morning, the plain had become an artist's canvas, with death as medium and corpses as materials. Achilles arranged his kills in patterns visible from Troy's walls, mockeries of religious symbols, perversions of sacred geometries. The sun rose higher, heating bronze and flesh, until the stench of death rose like incense from a profane altar. A counterattack emerged from the gates. Proper warriors this time, led by one of Hector's brothers. They advanced in traditional formation, shields locked, spears ready. Their leader called upon Zeus for protection, his voice carrying clearly across the bloody field. Achilles met them alone, his iron armor dark with dried blood. The first rank died in 6 heartbeats, their formation meaning nothing against calculated brutality. Bronze shields shattered, spears broke, and men fell, in pieces. Their leader lasted longest, skill keeping him alive through 3 exchanges before Achilles opened him from collar to groin. His last sight was his own heart still beating in its cage of broken ribs. "Efficient," Odysseus commented, watching Achilles clean his blade. "But perhaps we could take prisoners, learn Hector's location." Every death draws him closer. Achilles surveyed his work with critical eye. Each corpse adds weight to his burden. He'll come to me, driven by the guilt of lives he might have saved. The afternoon brought larger battles, proper military engagements that Achilles transformed into abattoir exhibition. Traditional tactics meant nothing against his new methodology of slaughter. The myrmidons struck from unexpected angles, turning formation fighting into intimate butchery. Men died in pieces, limbs separated, bodies opened, heads removed with surgical care. Near the river, they found a group of Apollo's priests performing purification rites. White robes turned red as Achilles demonstrated the futility of prayer against bronze and skill. He took his time with them, making each death unique, positioning bodies in blasphemous poses that mocked their interrupted ceremony. "You see?" he called to the distant walls. "Your gods can't even protect their own servants. There is only skill, only strength, only the truth of bronze meeting flesh." The day's greatest slaughter came at sunset. A desperate sally from the gates, perhaps 300 warriors trying to break the psychological grip of the hunt. They came with proper discipline, shields raised, spears steady. Their officers called on every god in heaven for protection. Achilles met them with the full Myrmidon force, but not in traditional combat. No shield wall, no answering charge. Instead, they demonstrated warfare stripped to its bloody essence. Arrows found eyes and throats. Javelins shattered formations. Cavalry struck flanks, turning organization into chaos. Then the killing began in earnest. What followed was not battle, but orchestrated slaughter. Achilles moved through the chaos like death given form, each kill adding to his growing work of art. Men died in ways that would haunt survivors' dreams. Bodies split, limbs removed, heads positioned to watch their own corpses cool. The Myrmidons followed their leader's example, turning the battlefield into a butcher's gallery. When it was done, Achilles walked the field alone, adjusting positions, arranging limbs, creating patterns in cooling flesh. The setting sun painted, everything in shades of red and gold, turning bronze armor into mirrors that reflected the day's bloody work. "How many watched from the walls?" he asked Odysseus, who had observed the entire performance. "How many saw their gods fail to answer prayers?" "All of them," Odysseus replied quietly. "And that's what truly terrifies them, not just the killing, but the method. You've turned death into art, warfare into butchery. I've stripped away illusion." Achilles surveyed his work with critical eye, shown them the truth of warfare without divine pretense. He looked toward Troy's walls, where torches were beginning to light the gathering dark. "Tomorrow we hunt again. Tomorrow we add more lessons to the gallery." Night fell fully, stars emerging like holes in heaven's bronze shield. On the plain before Troy, the dead lay in their careful patterns, blood seeping into soil that had drunk deep of mortality through 10 years of siege. And in his tent, Achilles cleaned his weapons, with methodical care, preparing for another day of teaching Troy the price of faith. The hunt would continue until Hector emerged to face its truth, and then perhaps even the gods would learn to fear what mortals could become when stripped of comforting illusions. After all, what was divine power compared to human will? What were heaven's laws compared to mortal grief turned to coldest purpose? Tomorrow would bring more lessons written in blood and bone. And slowly, death by death, prayer by unanswered prayer, Troy would learn to fear not divine wrath, but mortal determination. For in the end, that was Achilles' greatest lesson, the E. Gods might watch, but only human hands could craft such perfect horror. Blood had a voice, Achilles had discovered. It whispered different songs depending on how it fell. The soft patter of arterial spray on bronze shields, the thick gurgle of a pierced throat, the wet slap of severed limbs hitting packed earth. By the hunt's 7th day, he had learned to conduct these sounds like a maestro, orchestrating death into terrible symphonies. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruise purple and wound red as Achilles selected his instruments. The iron armor went on piece by piece, each plate stained dark with layers of dried blood that he deliberately left uncleaned. His spears were arranged by purpose, the heavy one for shield breaking, the light one for throat seeking, the mid-length one for the intimate work of disemboweling. "They're calling you Thanatos now," Odysseus said from the tent's entrance. "Death himself walking among mortals." "No." Achilles tested a spear point with his thumb, drawing a bead of red. "Death is divine. I am something worse, a man who has learned to surpass the gods at their own craft." The day's first lesson began at a small shrine near the beach. 3 priests of Apollo had taken shelter there overnight, burning incense and chanting prayers for protection. Achilles approached alone, his iron armor drinking the morning light. The priest's prayers rose higher, more desperate as he drew near. "Demonstrate your god's power," he told them calmly. "Show me divine protection made manifest. Prove me wrong." Their deaths were composed with artistic precision. The first lost his arms at the elbows, then the knees, then finally his head, transformed into components for Achilles' growing gallery. The second was opened from navel to throat, his organs removed with surgical care and arranged around him like the petals of some obscene flower. The third was kept alive longest, positioned to watch the composition unfold before his own dismemberment began. "An interesting arrangement," Odysseus observed when it was done. "You've grown more creative. Each death is a lesson." Achilles adjusted a severed hand's position, angling the fingers into a mockery of prayer. The gods fail to protect, even their most devoted. Only human skill determines who lives and dies. Word of the shrine's desecration spread through Troy's ranks like poison through veins. Soldiers who had fought bravely yesterday now trembled at their posts, eyes constantly scanning the plain for iron dark armor. Their officers spoke of duty and courage, but their voices shook when the hunting horns began to blow. The Myrmidons had learned their commander's methods well. They moved across the battlefield like shadows given form, each kill a demonstration of human efficiency, unmarred by divine ceremony. Traditional combat formations meant nothing against their new methodology of slaughter. They struck from unexpected. Angles turned shield walls into abattoirs, transformed heroic stands into studies in dismemberment. Near midday, they found a group of Trojan champions practicing war rites before a makeshift altar. The warriors had arranged themselves in the traditional circle, weapons raised in salute to heaven. Achilles waited until their prayers reached crescendo before beginning his work. "Watch closely," he instructed his men as he moved through the group. "Note how the spine severs cleanly at the 4th vertebra. See how arterial spray patterns change based on blade angle. Learn the music of their dying." When the killing was done, he arranged the corpses in a new configuration, a mockery of their ritual circle. Each body was positioned with mathematical precision, limbs angled to catch light and shadow. Their own altar became the centerpiece, decorated with components he had harvested with surgical care. The afternoon brought larger engagements as Troy's commanders tried to break the psychological grip of the hunt. A sally force of 500 emerged from the gates, shields locked, spears bristling. Their officers called upon every god in the pantheon for protection. The air filled with prayers and battle hymns. Achilles met them with the full Myrmidon force, but not in traditional combat. No shield wall, no answering charge. Instead, they demonstrated warfare evolved into butcher's art. Arrows found eyes and throats with mechanical precision. Javelins shattered formations into bloody components. Cavalry struck flanks, turning organization into chaos. Then the real work began. What followed was not battle but orchestrated slaughter. Achilles moved through the chaos like a sculptor approaching marble, each kill adding to his growing masterpiece. Men died in ways that would haunt survivors' dreams, bodies split with geometric precision, limbs removed in careful sequence, heads positioned to watch their own corpses cool. The Myrmidons followed their leader's example, turning the battlefield into a gallery of mortal horror. "Observe," Achilles called to the walls as he worked. "This is warfare stripped of divine pretense. This is truth written in blood and bone. Your gods cannot save you. Your prayers fall on deaf ears. There is only skill, only will, only the reality of bronze meeting flesh. A Trojan champion tried to rally his men, calling upon Apollo for strength. Achilles took him apart piece by piece, timing each cut to interrupt specific prayers. When only the head remained, still mouthing supplications, he positioned it atop a spear where it could watch its body's components being arranged into new patterns. The killing continued until sunset painted the plain in shades of arterial red. Achilles walked the battlefield like an artist surveying his gallery, adjusting positions, perfecting angles, ensuring each tableau conveyed its message clearly. The cooling corpses wore expressions of horror, confusion, desperate faith, broken by methodical brutality. As darkness fell, torches bloomed along Troy's walls like stars. Figures could be seen moving along the battlements, watching the arrangement of their dead below. Achilles stood in plain view, cleaning his spears with methodical care, ensuring every observer understood the promise of tomorrow's hunt. "You've changed the nature of warfare itself," Odysseus observed, watching the torchlit walls. "They don't fear death anymore. They fear you, what you represent. The death of faith itself." "Good." Achilles tested a spear point's edge. "Faith is a chain that binds them to divine masters who care nothing for mortal suffering. I'm teaching them to break those chains one corpse at a time." The night deepened, but sleep came rarely to either camp. In Troy's towers, soldiers whispered prayers that felt increasingly hollow. Along the walls, sentries jumped at shadows, knowing that dawn would bring new horrors. Even the Greek forces watched their champion with growing unease, seeing how his methodical brutality spread like contagion through their ranks. In his tent, Achilles prepared for the next day's work with surgeon's precision. Spears were arranged by purpose, blade edges honed to perfection, armor positioned for efficient donning. Each tool had its place in his growing methodology of slaughter. "They say Hector speaks of meeting you," a scout reported, "that the weight of all these deaths drives him to action." "Good." Achilles didn't look up from his work. Let him come. Let him see what his faith in divine protection has cost his people. Let him learn what mortals can become when stripped of comforting illusions. The night wore on, stars watching like holes in heaven's shield. On the plain before Troy, the dead lay in their careful patterns, blood seeping into soil that had drunk deep of mortality through 10 years of siege. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new demonstrations, new additions to the growing gallery of horror. For this was Achilles' true vengeance, not merely killing Troy's defenders, but killing their faith itself. Each death was a lesson, each corpse a testament to divine indifference. And slowly, prayer by unanswered prayer, the lesson spread. The gods might watch, but only human hands could craft such perfect horror. In the distance, Troy's walls stood silent and eternal, their stones weathered by centuries of mortal ambition and divine indifference. But even those ancient stones seemed to shudder at what approached with the dawn, not divine wrath or heroic fury, but something far worse. Mortal skill turned to coldest purpose, human will stripped of all restraint. The hunt would continue until Hector emerged to face its truth. And then perhaps even the gods would learn to fear what they had created in their arrogance. For what was divine power compared to mortal determination? What were heaven's laws compared to human grief transformed into art? Tomorrow would bring more lessons written in blood and bone, and slowly, death by death, Troy would learn to fear not divine wrath, but mortal potential unleashed. For in the end, that was Achilles' greatest message. The gods might laugh at human suffering, but human hands could craft horrors that would make even heaven weep. The walls of Troy bore witness to 10 years of slaughter, but they had never seen anything like this. Dawn's first light revealed Achilles' latest work. 1,000 corpses arranged in concentric circles before the Scaean gate, each body positioned with surgical precision. At the pattern's center stood a single spear, thrust into the earth. Upon it hung the head of yesterday's last victim, a priest of Apollo, his eyes wide and staring, mouth frozen in interrupted prayer. Within Troy's walls, Hector stood upon the battlements, his bronze armor catching the rising sun. He had watched for 7 days as Achilles transformed warfare into methodical horror, had seen how each death added to the growing gallery of atrocity. The weight of all those souls pressed upon him like physical chains, each unanswered prayer another link, binding him to inevitable confrontation. "The gods will protect you," Paris said beside him, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. "Apollo guides your spear, Zeus strengthens your arm. Look there." Hector pointed to where Achilles moved through his masterpiece of death, adjusting limbs and angles with artist's precision. "Look how he arranges their bodies. Each position mocks a sacred pose, each death defies divine authority, and still the gods do nothing." Below, Achilles began his morning's work. A group of young warriors had tried to recover bodies in the night. He found them easily, following their trails of fear like a hunter scenting prey. Their deaths were composed with mathematical care, each warrior positioned to mirror a statue in Apollo's temple, their own weapons turned against them, in ways that transformed religious imagery into obscene mockery. "Observe," his voice carried clearly to the walls. "See how your gods fail to protect even those who seek to honor the dead. There is only skill, only will, only the truth of bronze meeting flesh." The killing continued through morning's hours, each death adding to the growing exhibition. Achilles moved across the battlefield like a sculptor approaching marble, every strike precise, every wound placed with deliberate purpose. The Myrmidons followed his example, turning combat into butchers. Craft. Traditional formations meant nothing against their methodology of slaughter. Near midday, a counterattack emerged from the gates. 300 warriors led by Deiphobus, Hector's brother. They advanced in proper phalanx, shields locked, spears bristling. Their war cry carried clearly, "For Troy! For Apollo!" Achilles met them alone, his iron armor dark with dried blood. The first rank died in 6 heartbeats, their formation shattered by systematic brutality. Bronze shields crumpled, spears shattered, men fell in pieces. Deiphobus lasted longest, skill keeping him alive through 4 exchanges, before Achilles opened him from collar to groin. His last sight was his own heart, still beating in its cage of broken ribs. On the walls, Hector watched his brother fall. Each death added weight to his burden, each unanswered prayer another stone in the mountain of guilt pressing upon his shoulders. He felt the eyes of Troy upon him, soldiers, civilians, priests, all wondering when their champion would face this architect of horror. "The gods test us," a priest of Apollo said, his voice shaking as he watched Achilles arrange Deiphobus's corpse in mockery of religious ritual. "They will not abandon their chosen city." "The gods watch and do nothing," Hector cut him off. "While he turns our dead into art, heaven remains silent. There is truth in his blasphemy. We are alone." The afternoon brought fresh horror as Achilles began his hunt in earnest. He moved methodically through Troy's outer defenses, each kill adding to his growing exhibition. Warriors died in ways that would haunt survivors' dreams. Bodies split, with geometric precision, limbs removed in careful sequence, heads positioned to watch their own corpses cool. A group of Apollo's priests tried to perform purification rites over the mounting dead. Achilles found them at their work, surrounded by censers and sacred oils. Their prayers rose higher, more desperate as he approached. He took his time with them, ensuring each death mocked a specific ritual. When he finished, the sacred space had been transformed into a gallery of blasphemous tableaus. "Watch," he called to the walls, his voice carrying clearly over the field of death. "Watch how your gods abandon even their most devoted. There is no divine protection, no sacred power, only skill, only will, only the truth written in blood and bone." As sunset approached, Hector could bear the weight no longer. He descended from the walls, each step heavy with destiny. His armor, polished that morning, reflected the dying light like captured flame. Soldiers parted before him, their eyes showing mixed fear and hope. Their champion going to face the monster, divine protection against mortal fury. At the gates, Andromache waited with their son. No words were exchanged. What could be, said in such a moment? She touched his armor once, fingers tracing the religious symbols carved into bronze. Then she turned away, carrying their child to safety, unable to watch what would follow. The gates opened with ponderous finality. Hector stepped onto the killing field, his boots leaving prints in soil soaked with 7 days of slaughter. The evening air carried the copper scent of death, the sweet rot of corruption, the lingering incense of interrupted ritual. Each breath filled his lungs with the cost of pride, his own, his city's, the gods themselves. Achilles waited at the center of his masterpiece, surrounded by concentric circles of cooling corpses. His iron armor drank the dying light, making him seem like a void in the shape of a man. When he moved, it was with the precise grace of a surgeon approaching his work. "Finally," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the field of dead, "Heaven's champion comes to face mortal truth." Hector raised his spear in traditional salute. "The gods." "The gods watch and do nothing," Achilles cut him off. "They watched when you killed Patroclus. They watched through 7 days of slaughter. They watch now, indifferent to all our suffering." He raised his own spear, its bronze head catching the last light like frozen blood. "Let us show them what mortals can do." The sun sank toward horizon, painting the sky in shades of wound red and bruise purple. On Troy's walls, every eye focused on the 2 figures standing amid the garden of dead. Divine champion against mortal fury, faith against methodology, heavens chosen facing the man who had made gods tremble. The hunt was ending. The slaughter would reach its culmination. And in that dying light, before the walls of eternal Troy, heaven itself would learn to fear what mortals could become when stripped of all restraint. For this was Achilles' final lesson. The gods might watch, but only human hands could craft. Such perfect horror. Bronze rang against iron as destiny itself took form in metal and flesh. Hector's spear slid past Achilles' guard like divine lightning, only to be turned aside by a twist of mortal skill that spoke of countless hours of practice. The sound echoed across the plain of death, carried to the watching thousands by the evening wind that tasted of copper and fear. "You still fight like they taught you," Achilles observed, his voice carrying the calm of a surgeon discussing technique. Every move blessed by Apollo, every stance a prayer. He countered with a thrust of mechanical precision, testing Hector's defenses. "But I see the doubt in your eyes. You begin to understand." Their weapons met again, a symphony of metal that made the watching armies flinch. Hector fought with all the skill heaven had granted him, perfect form, divine strength, movements that had been practiced in temples since time immemorial. But Achilles fought like something new. Each strike calculated, each motion stripped of unnecessary flourish, every attack aimed at gaps that traditional training left exposed. "The gods gave me this skill," Hector declared, his spear describing a perfect arc that should have taken Achilles' throat. "Their wisdom guides. The gods gave you chains." Achilles slipped the strike with engineered precision, his counterthrust, drawing first blood, a shallow cut along Hector's ribs that drew gasps from the walls. "Every lesson they taught limits you. Every blessing binds you. Watch." What followed was a demonstration of warfare evolved beyond divine instruction. Achilles moved like water, finding cracks in stone, his attacks targeting not the obvious openings that traditional combat prepared for, but the subtle gaps that religious training never considered. Hector's perfect form began to falter as wounds accumulated, small cuts placed with surgical care, each one a lesson written in blood. "See how your shield arm drops after the 3rd defensive swing?" Another cut, this one behind Hector's knee, a flaw built into the very forms they taught you, divine wisdom, leaving mortal weakness. A thrust that parted bronze scales over Hector's shoulder. Every prayer you learned cost you a moment of practical study. Every blessing made you rely on power that was never truly yours. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of arterial red. On Troy's walls, soldiers who had worshipped Hector as the perfect warrior watched their champion's divine training dissected by cold methodology. Each wound was a message, each drop of blood a testament to the price of faith. Hector fought back with desperate courage, calling upon every lesson learned in Apollo's temples. His spear moved like lightning, his shield became a wall of bronze, his voice rang with prayers that had inspired armies. But each perfect form was countered by calculated efficiency, every divine technique stripped bare by mortal innovation. "How you fought my friend with heaven's blessing," Achilles noted, sliding past another textbook thrust. "You stripped my armor from his corpse with divinely guided hands." His counterstrike shattered Hector's shield at a structurally perfect point, bronze peeling away like dead skin. "But I studied that armor for years, learned every joint, every weakness, every flaw the gods built into their perfect gift." Their dance of blood and bronze drew patterns across the killing field, feet disturbing the carefully arranged corpses of 7 days' slaughter. Each movement told its own story, Hector's desperation mounting as divine protection failed him, piece by piece, Achilles' cold precision dismantling a lifetime of religious training with mechanical efficiency. "The gods don't determine victory," Achilles lectured, his voice carrying to every watching ear. "Skill does, training does, will does." His spear found another gap, opened another wound. "I'll prove it to them, prove it to everyone who watches. Heaven itself will learn to fear what mortals can become." Hector's counterattack was perfect, a combination of strikes that had won 100 duels, blessed by Apollo himself. The spear thrust would have taken Achilles' heart, a killing blow straight from divine instruction. But Achilles had studied such perfection, had learned to see the mortal flaws in heavenly technique. His dodge was engineered rather than inspired, his counterstrike calculated rather than blessed. The iron spear took Hector in the throat, angled precisely to slip between bronze scales. Blood painted the evening air like scattered rubies as Achilles stepped past the falling body, his movement an exhibition of economy rather than ceremony. The watching armies held their breath as Troy's champion fell to his knees, divine perfection, undone by mortal methodology. Achilles gave his defeated foe a moment to comprehend, to see how religious devotion had failed, how divine protection had proven weaker than human innovation. Then he moved with surgeon's precision, his blade, describing a perfect arc that separated head from shoulders. No ceremony, no gloating, just efficient completion of a task long studied. He lifted the head by its blood-matted hair, turned to face the walls where priests had taught Hector his perfect flawed techniques. The move was calculated for maximum effect, every eye forced to see heaven's champion undone, every mind confronted with the price of faith. "Look upon your gods chosen," his voice carried like bronze on bronze. "See how divine protection fails. There is only skill, only will, only the truth of mortality itself." The head flew in a perfect arc, its trajectory plotted with mathematical precision. It landed before Troy's gates with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of faith. In that moment, watching thousands learned Achilles' ultimate lesson. The gods might choose champions, but mortal hands determined victory. He turned then to his masterpiece of death, to the gallery of corpses arranged in patterns that mocked divine geometry. Hector's body would become the centerpiece, positioned to tell its own story of heaven's failure. But the head would remain before the gates, a message written in flesh and bone. No gods could protect against human will unleashed. The sun touched horizon, setting the sky ablaze in colors that matched the day's slaughter. On Troy's walls, prayers died stillborn on trembling lips as soldiers confronted a new kind of fear, not of divine wrath but of mortal potential, stripped of all restraint. For Achilles had taught them his truth. The gods might watch, but only human hands could craft such perfect horror. And in the gathering dark, as bronze dulled and blood cooled, heaven itself seemed to shudder at what it had witnessed. Not just the death of its champion, but the birth of something new. Warfare evolved beyond divine constraints, mortality risen to heights that made even the gods tremble. The hunt was ended, the lesson was taught, and in the silence that followed, every watching soul confronted the price of faith undone by mortal truth. They burned no offerings that night. From the heights of Troy's walls to the depths of the Greek camps, not a single prayer rose to heaven. The smoke from cooking fires carried only the scent of meat and fear, untainted by sacrificial incense for the first time in 10 years of siege. In that silence, that absence of supplication, Achilles' victory found its truest expression. Dawn revealed his final work. Hector's body arranged at the center of a vast spiral of corpses, each positioned with mathematical precision to tell a story of divine failure. The dead formed lines that led inward like spokes of a wheel, their weapons and armor placed to catch the rising sun and reflect its light toward the gates where Hector's head still rested, eyes fixed eternally on the heaven that had failed him. An interesting composition, Odysseus observed, studying the patterns from horseback. The morning breeze carried the copper scent of old blood and newer fear across the plain. You've arranged them to mirror the constellations the priests use for prophecy. Inverted, Achilles corrected, making a final adjustment to a severed arm's angle. Each line mocks a divine pattern, every corpse positioned to demonstrate heaven's impotence. He stepped back to study the effect. The gods claim to write our fates in stars. I've written their failure in flesh and bone. The impact of his work spread through both armies like poison through veins. In the Greek camps, traditional pre-battle rituals fell away, replaced by practical preparation. Warriors who had once spent hours in prayer now devoted that time to weapon practice, studying Achilles' methodical techniques. The Myrmidons had become teachers, showing how efficiency could replace ceremony, how human skill could surpass divine blessing. Among the Trojans, the transformation cut deeper. Temples stood empty as priests struggled to explain their god's silence. Warriors who had trusted in divine protection now studied their own defenses with cold eyes, seeking the mortal flaws that Achilles had exposed in their heaven-blessed champion. Even the common people had begun to change, their prayers replaced by a new kind of calculation, what mortals could achieve when stripped of religious constraint. "They say you've killed more than faith," Odysseus said, watching a group of young soldiers practicing Achilles' precise killing techniques. "That you've birthed something new, a way of warfare that makes even the gods irrelevant." "I've shown." "Truth." Achilles cleaned his spears with methodical care, each motion exact and purposeful. "That's all. Stripped away comfortable lies about divine protection, shown what mortals can achieve when they stop looking to heaven for strength. The morning's first kills demonstrated this truth. A sally from Troy's gates, perhaps 200 warriors testing whether divine punishment would fall upon their champion's killer. They fought differently now, no battle hymns, no prayers for protection. But they hadn't fully embraced Achilles' methods either, caught between old faith and new understanding. He met them with surgical precision, each death composed to reinforce his lesson. Warriors died in ways that anatomists would later study. Their bodies opened along planes that revealed mortal structure with scientific accuracy. The Myrmidons followed his example, turning battle into a lecture on human vulnerability written in blood and bronze. "Watch," he called to the walls as he worked. "See how flesh parts, how bone breaks, how blood flows. These are the only truths that matter, not divine will, not heavenly favor. Just the reality of metal meeting meat with sufficient skill." By midday, the plain had become a new kind of classroom. Warriors from both armies gathered to watch Achilles demonstrate his methodology, their traditional enmity forgotten in fascination. With this new approach to death, he showed them how traditional combat forms contained fatal flaws, how religious ceremony wasted motion that could be used for killing, how efficiency could replace ritual. "You're teaching them more than warfare," Odysseus noted as they watched the lessons spread. "You're teaching them to think differently about everything, about faith, about power, about what mortals can achieve." "Good." Achilles surveyed his growing influence with surgeon satisfaction. "Let them learn. Let them see how much stronger they become when they stop reaching for divine hands that never grasp back." The afternoon brought proof of his success as Troy launched another attack. This time the warriors came without religious symbols, without battle hymns, without prayers for protection. They fought with calculated precision, each movement stripped of ceremonial flourish. The battle became a demonstration of mortality, embracing its own power. Achilles walked the battlefield like a teacher surveying students' work, correcting techniques, adjusting angles of attack, showing how each kill could be made more efficient. The dead he arranged in new patterns, each corpse positioned to tell its own story of humanity's potential unleashed. "They're calling it a new age," Odysseus said, as sunset painted the sky in colors that matched the day's bloodshed. An age where mortals shape their own fates, where human will outweighs divine decree. Names don't matter. Achilles positioned a final corpse, angling the head to stare at heaven's indifference. Only truth matters, only what we can achieve when we stop pretending gods determine victory. As darkness fell, fires bloomed along Troy's walls, not sacrificial flames or ritual blazes, but simple human lights to pierce the gathering dark. The change was spreading, transforming how men thought about power and fate and their own potential. Achilles had killed more than Troy's champion. He had killed an entire way of seeing the world. In his tent that night, he cleaned his weapons. With practiced care, each motion exact and purposeful. No prayers were offered, no libations poured. Just the methodical preparation of tools that would write tomorrow's lessons in flesh and bone. The gods might watch from their mountain, but their time of influence was ending. A new kind of power was rising, forged not in divine fire but in mortal understanding. Achilles had shown what humanity could achieve when stripped of religious constraint, and that knowledge could never be untaught. Heaven itself would learn to fear what it had created, not through supernatural might or divine blessing, but through the simple, terrible efficiency of human potential unleashed. The hunt had ended, but the lesson continued. Each death added to the growing curriculum. Each kill demonstrated the power of mortality embracing its own strength. And slowly, corpse by corpse, prayer by abandoned prayer, the world began to change. For this was Achilles' true victory, not just killing heaven's champion, but killing heaven's hold on mortal minds. He had shown a new kind of power, one that made even the gods tremble. For what was divine might compared to human will? What were heaven's laws compared to mortal determination? Night deepened over the plain of Troy, stars emerging like holes in heaven's shield. Below, the dead lay in their careful patterns, blood seeping into soil that had drunk deep of mortality through 10 years of siege. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new demonstrations, new proof that humanity needed no divine blessing to achieve terrible greatness. And in that darkness, as bronze dulled and blood cooled, a new truth took root. The gods might watch, but mortals would determine their own fates. For Achilles had taught them this final lesson. Divine power was nothing compared to human potential, stripped of all restraint. The age of gods was ending. The age of mortal will had begun. Truth, Achilles had discovered, spread like blood through water, in patterns both beautiful and terrible, transforming everything it touched. By the siege's final dawn, his methodology of slaughter had infected both armies like a fever, turning traditional warfare into something colder, more precise, stripped of divine pretense. The plain before Troy had become not just a battlefield, but a classroom where every death taught lessons that would echo through centuries. The morning air carried no incense, no sacrificial smoke, no prayers to distant gods. Instead, it tasted of iron and oil and purpose, the sense of men preparing tools rather than beseeching deities. In the Greek camps, warriors honed weapons. With mathematical precision, each whetstone stroke calculated for maximum efficiency. The Myrmidons had become teachers, showing how to turn combat into surgery, how to strip away ceremonial flourish in favor of lethal economy. "They're calling it the new art," Odysseus observed, watching young soldiers practice killing techniques with the focus of physicians studying anatomy. Not warfare anymore, but something else, something that makes gods irrelevant. Names don't matter. Achilles surveyed his work, not just the field of corpses arranged in blasphemous patterns, but the transformation of minds and methods. Only truth matters, only what we achieve when we stop reaching for divine hands that never grasp back. The day's first demonstration began at Troy's gates. A sortie of 300 warriors emerged, but they fought differently now. No battle hymns, no religious symbols, no prayers for protection. They had learned from watching Achilles work, had begun to understand that survival depended not on divine favor, but on human skill. Their formation was tight, movements precise, each action stripped of unnecessary ceremony. Achilles met them with cold approval, turning the engagement into another lesson. Each kill was composed to demonstrate specific principles: how flesh parted along anatomical planes, how bone broke at structural weak points, how blood flowed in predictable patterns. The Myrmidons followed his example, transforming battle into a lecture written in bronze and blood. "Watch," he called as he worked, his voice carrying to observers on both sides. "See how mortality expresses itself through proper technique. This is power without divine pretense. This is truth without ceremony." The fighting spread across the morning hours, but it was different now. Methodical, almost academic. Warriors from both armies stopped to study particularly efficient kills, discussing technique like scholars at a symposium. The traditional barriers between Greek and Trojan began to blur as a new understanding took root. They were all students of this new methodology, all learners in the school of mortal potential. Near midday, a group of Apollo's remaining priests attempted one final ritual, carrying sacred implements onto the battlefield. Achilles took his time with them, turning their deaths into a comprehensive demonstration of human vulnerability. Each wound was placed with surgical precision, each killing stroke calculated to expose specific anatomical truths. "Observe," he lectured as he worked. "Note how the spine severs cleanly at the fourth vertebra. See how arterial spray patterns change based on blade angle. These are the only mysteries worth studying, not divine will but mortal structure." The afternoon brought larger engagements as Troy's commanders launched increasingly desperate attacks. But the nature of warfare itself had changed. No more heroic duels, no exchanges of lineage, no appeals to divine protection. Instead, combat had become a cold science, with efficiency replacing ceremony and calculation replacing courage. Achilles walked the battlefield like a teacher surveying students' work, correcting techniques, adjusting angles of attack, showing how each kill could be made more precise. The dead he arranged in new patterns, each corpse positioned to tell its own story of humanity's potential unleashed. Even the Trojans had begun to study his arrangements, learning from the anatomical truths revealed in cooling flesh. "You've created something new," Odysseus noted as they watched the transformation spread. "Not just a way of fighting, but a way of thinking. You've shown them that mortality itself is a kind of power. I've shown them truth." Achilles cleaned his spears with methodical care, each motion exact and purposeful. "That divine blessing is a chain, divine protection a cage. Real power comes from understanding our own nature, our own potential." The evening's final battle demonstrated how completely his influence had spread. 1,000 Trojan warriors emerged from the gates, led by Paris himself. But they came without religious symbols, without battle hymns, without prayers for protection. They fought with calculated precision, each movement stripped of ceremonial flourish. The battle became a demonstration of mortality embracing its own power. Achilles moved through their ranks like a surgeon through tissue, each kill composed to reinforce specific lessons. Paris he saved for last, taking him apart piece by piece with academic thoroughness. As Troy's prince died, his last words were not prayers but observations on technique, acknowledging the efficiency of his own dismemberment. When darkness fell, fires bloomed along Troy's walls, not sacrificial flames or ritual blazes, but simple human lights to pierce the gathering dark. The change had become complete, transforming how men thought about power and fate and their own potential. Achilles had killed more than warriors. He had killed an entire way of seeing the world. In his tent that night, he prepared his tools. With practiced care, each motion exact and purposeful. No prayers were offered, no libations poured. Just the methodical preparation for tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's demonstrations of mortal capability unleashed. "They say the city will fall soon," Odysseus observed from the tent's entrance, "that your new methodology makes traditional defenses meaningless." The city's walls fell days ago. Achilles tested a spear point's edge with scientific precision. The real walls, the ones built of faith and divine protection, what remains is just stone, and stone cannot stand against human will properly applied. Dawn brought proof of his words as Troy's defenses began to crumble, not through divine intervention or heroic action, but through the calculated application of mortal skill. The Greeks had learned their lessons well, attacking with surgical precision at structural weak points. Each breach was achieved through careful study rather than brute force, each advance planned with mathematical accuracy. Achilles watched from the plain, surrounded by his gallery of educational corpses. The city's fall would be his final demonstration, proof that even the most ancient stronghold could not withstand mortality, stripped of religious constraint. Troy had stood for centuries under divine protection, but it would fall to human determination properly focused. As the walls began to break, he made one last arrangement of the dead. A vast pattern of corpses, positioned with geometric precision, telling the story of humanity's transformation. At its center lay Paris, opened with anatomical accuracy to display the truth beneath divine pretense. Around him, concentric circles of bodies demonstrated the progression from religious warfare to mortal science. "Your masterwork?" Odysseus asked, studying the pattern's complexity. "A lesson." Achilles surveyed his creation with clinical satisfaction. Written so clearly that even the gods must understand. Their time of influence ends. The age of mortal will begins. The city's fall continued through afternoon and evening, each phase demonstrating new principles of efficient slaughter. The Greeks had learned to fight without divine inspiration, to kill without religious ceremony. Every advance was calculated, every death composed to prove specific points about mortal potential. Night fell on a Troy transformed, not just conquered, but converted. Its temples had become lecture halls where Achilles' students studied the architecture of death. Its palace hosted demonstrations of efficient killing techniques. Even its sacred spaces had been turned to new purpose, hosting anatomical investigations that stripped divinity down to bone and sinew. The fires that burned that night were not offerings to distant gods, but simple human tools, casting light by which to study mortality's truth. The smoke carried no prayers, no supplications, no religious ceremony. Instead, it tasted of iron and purpose and possibility, the flavors of a world where humans had learned to stand without divine crutches. In the final midnight, Achilles walked the conquered city's streets. Each step took him past evidence of humanity's new understanding, past temples converted to schools of martial science, past altars transformed into demonstration spaces, past sacred grounds where students practiced killing techniques with mathematical precision. "They'll tell stories about this," Odysseus said, following through the transformed city. "About how you changed not just warfare but everything. How you taught men to stand without divine support. Let them tell truth then." Achilles surveyed his work, not just the conquered city, but the conquered minds, the transformed understanding. "Let them say I showed mortality its own strength. Let them say I taught men to break heaven's chains." The night deepened, stars watching like holes in heaven's shield. Below, the dead lay in their careful patterns, blood seeping into soil that had drunk deep of mortality through 10 years of siege. But this blood had taught new lessons, had written new truths in cooling flesh. The gods might watch, but their time of influence was ending. Dawn would bring a new age, not of divine guidance, but of mortal determination. Achilles had shown what humanity could achieve when stripped of religious constraint, and that knowledge could never be untaught. Heaven itself would learn to fear what it had created, not through supernatural might or divine blessing, but through the simple, terrible efficiency of human potential unleashed. For this was his true legacy. Not just victory over Troy, but victory over humanity's need for divine providence. He had shown a new kind of power, one that made even the gods tremble. For what was divine might compared to mortal will? What were heaven's laws compared to human determination? The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the transformation below. But their indifference no longer mattered. Achilles had taught humanity to stand alone, to find strength not in divine blessing, but in mortal capability. The age of gods was ending, written in blood and bone and broken faith. The age of mortal will had begun, and heaven itself would learn to fear what it had spawned.